Pelican Bay Prison Files, the darkest stories America tried to bury. Before this story disappears into silence, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and lock this channel in your memory, because what you're about to hear was never meant to be remembered. The alarm didn't scream. It clicked once, sharp and controlled, echoing down a concrete corridor that never saw daylight. At Pelican Bay State Prison, alarms didn't need drama. Everyone inside the security housing unit already lived in a permanent state of alert. Steel doors lined the corridor like sealed tombs, each one holding a man who hadn't touched another human being in years. In the early hours of a fog-heavy California morning, guards stopped outside cell D-117. The inmate inside wasn't responding. Pelican Bay's SHU was designed to erase influence. Built in the late 1980s near the Oregon border, it housed inmates deemed too dangerous to mix with others, often not because of new crimes, but because of alleged gang ties. Validation files replaced convictions. Paper replaced proof. Men were buried alive in concrete boxes roughly the size of a parking space, locked down for 22 to 23 hours a day, sometimes for decades. The man in D-117 had been there 8 years. When officers finally opened the food slot, they found him alive, but changed. He hadn't spoken in weeks. His eyes tracked the wall, not the people. Medical reports later described severe cognitive withdrawal. The official note was brief: inmate stabilized. No further action required. But something about that cell would quietly trigger a chain reaction that prison officials never expected. Pelican Bay was supposed to be invisible. No riots. No chaos. Just silence. But in the early 1990s, that silence began leaking into courtrooms, doctors' offices, and investigative files. Attorneys noticed patterns. Men sent to the SHU without end dates, without hearings that felt real, without knowing what they had done to earn indefinite isolation. Psychologists began documenting symptoms that didn't fade when prisoners were released back to general population. Panic attacks. Memory loss. Emotional numbness. A slow collapse of identity. At the center of the growing concern was a quiet investigator named Daniel Reyes, assigned to review internal classification records after a routine lawsuit crossed his desk. Reyes wasn't a crusader. He wasn't looking to expose anything. He was supposed to confirm that procedures had been followed. But as he moved from file to file, something didn't add up. Men were being validated as gang members based on drawings, possession of books, even the statements of anonymous informants they were never allowed to question. One man had been placed in the SHU after refusing to name others. Another after writing a letter that included a symbol later interpreted as gang-related, years after the fact. The paperwork justified everything. The reality justified nothing. Reyes requested interviews. What he heard unsettled him. Former SHU inmates described time losing meaning. Days blending into each other until memory itself felt unreliable. Some talked to themselves just to prove they still existed. Others stopped speaking altogether. One man said the worst part wasn't the isolation, it was the uncertainty. Not knowing when or if it would end. As Reyes dug deeper, resistance quietly followed. Requests delayed. Files redacted. Meetings cancelled. He was reminded politely that Pelican Bay housed the worst of the worst. That public sympathy was dangerous. That order required sacrifice. Then came the medical reports. Buried in archived evaluations was a sealed appendix never referenced in official summaries. It contained internal warnings from prison psychologists, early, explicit concerns that long-term isolation was causing irreversible psychological damage. The recommendations were clear: limit SHU terms, introduce meaningful human contact, reassess validation standards. None of it had been implemented. Reyes realized this wasn't negligence. It was policy. Late one night, alone in his office, he unlocked a final file he hadn't been cleared to access. Inside was a list of inmates scheduled for indefinite retention in the SHU. No timeline, no exit strategy, no review date. Some names had been there for over a decade. At the bottom of the page, one note stood out. Subject exhibits signs of psychological fragmentation. Removal not advised. Release may pose institutional risk. Reyes leaned back, the weight of it settling in. Pelican Bay wasn't just containing danger. It was manufacturing it. And that's when he realized something worse. The silence wasn't a side effect. It was the system working exactly as designed. By the time Daniel Reyes understood what Pelican Bay was truly hiding, the prison had already started watching him. It began subtly. A keycard that worked the day before suddenly didn't. An interview room double-booked at the last minute. Emails unanswered. At Pelican Bay, Silence wasn't just imposed on inmates, it was enforced on anyone who asked the wrong questions. Reyes felt it closing in, tightening like the steel doors he'd seen slam shut behind men who never knew when they'd open again. He shifted tactics. Instead of requesting access, he followed the paper trail backward: old grievances, sealed lawsuits, medical transfers that never happened. What emerged wasn't chaos, but coordination. Inmate after inmate had been flagged as a continued threat, right around the time they attempted legal action or refused to cooperate with internal intelligence gathering. The SHU wasn't only punishment. It was leverage. One name kept reappearing: Marcus Hale. Hale had entered Pelican Bay in 1989 on a sentence unrelated to gangs. Within 3 years, he was validated and sent to the SHU. The justification was thin: association claims, an informant statement that Hale had influence. No violent incidents. No contraband. Just suspicion. Hale spent the next 11 years in near total isolation. When Reyes finally located Hale, it wasn't in a cell. It was in a state hospital miles away. Hale sat motionless during the interview, his hands folded, eyes fixed on a point just past Reyes' shoulder. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but detached, like someone narrating someone else's life. He described the SHU as a place where sound became an enemy. Where the echo of your own breath felt intrusive. Where you learned to ration thoughts the way others rationed food. They said I was dangerous, Hale said quietly. But nothing makes you more dangerous than erasing who you are. Hale revealed something Reyes hadn't seen in any file. During his 7th year in isolation, he had been approached by prison officials with an offer: provide information, real or not, about alleged gang activity, and his SHU term would be reviewed. He refused. Weeks later, his mental health classification was downgraded. His isolation intensified. That wasn't punishment. That was retaliation. Reyes returned to Pelican Bay with renewed urgency. He wasn't just documenting harm anymore. He was tracing intent. And intent left fingerprints. But before he could submit his preliminary findings, something happened inside the SHU. An inmate collapsed during routine cell extraction. No resistance. No warning. He simply stopped responding. The official report labeled it a medical event. But the internal footage Reyes later reviewed told a different story. The inmate had been pacing, muttering, pressing his ear to the wall as if listening for something that wasn't there. He had been in isolation for 16 years. That night, Reyes received an anonymous message on his office voicemail. The voice was distorted, but the words were clear. Stop digging. You don't understand what you're interfering with. The next morning, 2 critical SHU files vanished from the archive system. Reyes knew then that this wasn't about administrative oversight or outdated policy. Pelican Bay's SHU had become a containment zone not just for inmates, but for accountability itself. Isolation ensured no witnesses, no shared memories, no collective voice. And the damage didn't end at the prison gates. Former SHU inmates released back into society showed alarming patterns: difficulty reconnecting, explosive anxiety, emotional flatness. Some reoffended. Others disappeared entirely. The public narrative was simple: hardened criminals failed to rehabilitate. The truth was far more uncomfortable. Pelican Bay wasn't failing rehabilitation. It was sabotaging it. As Reyes prepared to escalate his findings beyond the Department of Corrections, he uncovered one final detail, something buried deep in an interdepartmental memo marked non-disclosable. It outlined a classified risk assessment conducted years earlier. The conclusion was chilling. Extended isolation did not reduce long-term violence. It increased it. The SHU wasn't protecting the system. It was poisoning it. And as Reyes stared at the document, one question refused to leave his mind. If Pelican Bay knew the damage it was causing, why had it never stopped? Because the answer, he realized, would put far more than inmates in danger. The first thing Daniel Reyes noticed was how quickly the system turned on him once he stopped playing along. His access was revoked within 48 hours of submitting his findings to an external oversight committee. Officially, it was a temporary administrative pause. Unofficially, it was exile. He was escorted out of Pelican Bay by the same corridors he'd studied for months, the doors closing behind him with a finality that felt personal. The message was clear: the prison that erased men could erase careers too. But Reyes had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The documents he'd copied, risk assessments, internal memos, psychological evaluations, were already out of Pelican Bay's control. Attorneys had them. Journalists had them. And when the first investigative report aired, it did what silence never could. It made noise. Headlines focused on the SHU, men held in isolation for 10, 15, even 20 years. Validation based on inference. Reviews that weren't reviews. Doctors who warned early and often that the damage was permanent. The public response was immediate and polarized. Some called it necessary. Others called it torture. But the courts called it something else entirely. Unconstitutional. As lawsuits piled up, former inmates came forward. Marcus Hale testified via video, his voice steady, his words precise. He described losing the ability to recognize faces, to feel time, to trust his own thoughts. He described the moment he realized the SHU wasn't meant to change him, only to break him enough to comply. Then came the revelation Pelican Bay hadn't prepared for. An internal whistleblower, anonymous but verified, released a classified briefing prepared years earlier for senior officials. It concluded that prolonged isolation increased aggression, deepened gang identity, and raised the likelihood of violent recidivism upon release. The SHU didn't neutralize threats. It refined them. The briefing had been acknowledged. And ignored. In court, prison officials argued necessity, control, safety. But the evidence told a different story, one of a system that valued quiet over correction, obedience over justice. Judges ordered sweeping reforms, time limits on isolation, meaningful reviews, pathways out of the SHU that didn't require fabricated confessions. Pelican Bay complied on paper. In practice, change came slowly. Some inmates were released from isolation after decades. Many weren't ready. The world felt too loud, too fast, too close. Rehabilitation programs struggled to undo damage done in silence. And for some, there was no undoing it at all. Reyes watched the outcomes from a distance. He testified. He wrote. He was praised in public and sidelined in private. The system didn't thank him, but it adjusted, just enough to survive scrutiny. Years later, during a follow-up investigation, a reporter asked Reyes whether Pelican Bay had learned its lesson. He paused. Systems don't learn, he said. They adapt. Pelican Bay still stands. The SHU still exists. The doors still close the same way. But now, there are cameras watching the watchers. Reviews that leave a trail. Limits that can be challenged. It isn't justice. But it's friction. And friction makes silence harder to maintain. The darkest stories America tried to bury weren't about riots or escapes or bloodshed. They were about what happens when punishment outlasts purpose, when isolation becomes an identity, and quiet becomes a weapon. They were about men who disappeared without leaving the building, and a system that mistook compliance for safety. In the end, Pelican Bay didn't just imprison bodies. It tested how much of the human mind could be locked away before something irreversible broke. And the question it left behind still hasn't been answered. If silence can do this much damage, what else have we learned to accept simply because it's quiet? If this story stayed with you, there are more like it waiting in the dark. Subscribe, stay curious, and don't look away.